I was born in San Bartolome, Sogocho, up in the highlands of Oaxaca. I lived there until the age of 10. My parents sent for me in 1981, and they brought me to downtown LA, which was a total culture shock because there were no trees, there were no birds, there were no rivers, and there was no Zapotec speaking people. Between 10 and 20, I was, trying on a survival mode, learning slang, whatever it was to survive in a city like LA that did not speak my language.
Sí, ya se está perdiendo el dialecto zapoteco. Sí. Ahora lo que quieren hablar es, en los pueblos ya quieren hablar solo español. Cuando yo nací, empezamos a hablar solo zapoteco. Y cuando nosotros entramos en la escuela, en la primaria, los maestros no querían que habláramos dialecto ahí. Nos castigaban cuando nosotros hablábamos zapoteco en la clase.
An endangered language is a language that is losing speakers faster than it's gaining them. It's a growing problem in our world. Zapotec, like all the other languages I have worked on, is a wonderful, wonderful language and language family. I love these languages. It is frightening to me that they are more and more endangered every year. I think that anything that can be done to work on revitalizing them is a wonderful thing.
Currently, languages are disappearing at a rate of 9 languages yearly, and by the middle of next century, that number will reach 26 languages per year. Between 80 to 90% of the languages that are spoken worldwide will disappear within the next century.
It's especially tough for indigenous languages in Latin America because they are so ostracized. There's so much like racism and discrimination. It sort of makes you shy to even speak it.
You want to integrate. You don't want to be singled out for speaking your language, for being different.
Minority languages are being sort of forced out, and parents decide that it's better for their children to learn the majority language.
I am born here in Los Angeles. Both my parents are Zapotec. Both of them went through the Los Angeles Unified School District, speaking primarily Zapotec and not getting the language services they need. Eventually, when I was born, they taught me English first, and they didn't teach me Zapotec because they didn't want me to face kind of same systematic barriers that they had.
Indigenous languages have been, explicitly, targeted for extermination, from the imposition of linguistic policies, the criminalization of indigenous languages, formalized schooling as well that has a very detrimental impact to the survival of indigenous languages. It's a process that continues to happen.
El proceso del riesgo de la desaparición de las lenguas hay que comprenderlo como un proceso de genocidio silencioso para suprimir a un pueblo, para extinguir a un pueblo. Hay una política lingüicida y distingue que hay lenguas con ejército y lenguas sin ejército.
Indigenous languages are dying not only because of these processes of ethnocide, because of this, processes of migration and indigenous people shifting to using other languages, but it's also happening because indigenous territories are being destroyed and indigenous defenders are being killed.
When I got here, when I was a child, people were asking me if I was Mexican. I would say yes. And then, are you Hispano? Yes. Are you Latino? Yes. I didn't know what those things meant. And then I became Mexican. I became Latina. I became all the labels that has been imposed on me. But at the end of the day, I knew I was from Sogocho, but there was no place for me to say that. So as these these labels of Latinidad, for me are deadly. They're all Latinos, they're all Mexican, they're all brown, so they all speak Spanish. And that is not true, because in Mexico, there are 68 indigenous language families and more than 364 languages that are spoken. So those labels, those institutional racism and the discrimination is felt.
Language is not just a code of communication. It is a way that people manifest their epistemic thinking, their knowledge.
Language is really totally related to culture. And if a group of people lose their language, they've lost a big part of their culture.
There's different ways to see the world based on the language that you speak. Zapotec transmits a worldview. It transmits a way of life that's different than the one that we have.
Indigenous languages are part of our cultural diversity as humankind. When a language dies, that means that we are losing a very specific way of looking at the world.
For us, it was very important, especially for my community, for us to continue speaking the language, because we are that language.
CIELO, Comunidades Indígenas and Liderazgo is an Indigenous women-led nonprofit based here in Los Angeles. We provide interpretation services to around 300 people all throughout the United States, and we advocate for the rights, language rights, and human rights of Indigenous migrant people here in the U.S.
We needed to start CIELO. There was a need to continue advocating for Indigenous people's rights, but especially for women and children.
El trabajo que ha hecho CIELO por hace varios años ya nos muestra que este proceso no únicamente ocurrió con el proceso de la crisis de la frontera, sino más bien que las cortes, los hospitales, los centros de detención, las cárceles, tienen un talón de Aquiles, y es el que no se garantizan los derechos de manera, en un debido proceso y de una manera eficaz, dado que no existen las condiciones de intérpretes para que las personas conozcan sus derechos o puedan conocer de mejor manera sus indicaciones médicas.
It was an idea that we started way before 2015. We started having workshops. We started working with certain academics who had access to a lot of the documents of Indigenous people, the language, the ceremonial language. So those conversations made us think like, well, what else do we want to do? There suddenly all this information that is locked up in academia is getting to the community.
For our language revitalization program, we have 3 language programs that we currently are providing classes in. One is Zapoteco from the Sierra Norte, specifically from Sogocho. One is Mixteco from San Juan Mixtepec. And the 3rd language is Maya Yucateco from the Maya Peninsula.
There is not a one-size-fits-all model when it comes to linguistic revitalization, and there are various challenges that the communities are facing when it comes to revitalizing their languages. Some of those challenges could be associated with the lack of funding, with the lack of resources, with the lack of equipment, even with the lack of speakers.
Chalban, Pecurro.
Children are really the seeds of our culture, and they will, give continuity to the language and to that tradition.
We want the kids to learn the language, and how the kids will learn the language is through technology. So everybody collectively decided that they wanted use technology to continue learning, because we needed to be up to date with the young people's way of learning.
I think technology, especially over the past years, has been really important for linguistic revitalization efforts. There are various forms of technologies that Indigenous communities are manipulating, are appropriating in order to contribute to this efforts of linguistic revival. There's a great necessity that communities have to have their own materials to use in their specific context. And so technology in that sense offers that innovation of, creating different forms of materials, and that leads us to creativity as well.
The loteria comes about from our Zapotec class that we held with different people via Zoom during the pandemic. Loteria traditionally is played in a card and somebody calls out one of the cards, and it's kind of like bingo. You look for it on the grid, and the person that fills up their grid in a line is the first person to win. So what makes our loteria special is that it's in Zapotec. The words are in Zapotec, the drawings are culturally specific. For example, you have things in this loteria that you wouldn't find in another loteria, like pozontle. Pozontle is a really important drink in our community, right? It's a cacao-based drink that has like this foam on top, and you drink it in a little jicarita. And it's very culturally specific to Zapotecs from the Sierra Norte that drink that. It was one of the ones that we had the most debate about. How do you say it? How do you not borrow from Spanish? How do we keep the words in Zapotec? So I think it's really important to have a conservation of these different words, terms, and also imageries.
We all brought in our list of words, and we asked our aunts, our uncles, our parents, our grandparents who all speak Zapoteco. We have this list of words in Spanish, and can you help us translate them to Zapoteco? And we all had, that was our homework assignment, so we all had to bring it to class. And within a couple weeks, we started forming that initial list of 60 words.
La lotería es un gran acierto porque está dirigido a los niños en particular, pero no únicamente a los niños, estaba muy entretenida.
So initially, GitHub approached Odilia, and they were like, what would you like to see in technology? She was like, I would like to see a language app, for interpretation. I would like to see this, that. So eventually we landed on the loteria because we had already started the process within the Zapotec classes to start listing the words.
Because at GitHub Education, we really respect teachers and what we need, we spend a lot of time talking to them and finding out, what do you need in order to teach better? And we find out often that the thing that we would have built is not the thing that they want. That was really true with Loteria because I am not an Indigenous person. I am not a person that has had to leave their home country, their home place, and learn new languages and risk losing my own language. I don't know what they would necessarily need, what would help them with their language justice and their language preservation. So really learning that you have to talk to the experts and let them guide and build what they're asking for, rather than thinking, I am a software engineer, I know exactly what to build you, has been hugely helpful on this.
At GitHub, for the social impact team, we work very closely with a number of social sector organizations, not only with small grassroots organizations like CIELO, but with large international development ones as well, with the UN, UNDP, the World Health Organization. Why GitHub is interested is because the objective of skills-based volunteering is to be able to provide open source elements to social sector organizations and to connect GitHub staff to work on these problems in a way that is participatory, and it's something that we can continue to work on, not just a one-time type of initiative. So I reached out to the google.org team to ask, can they open source the Loteria Google Doodle that they created? But they went one step further, and they offered a number of employees, engineers, to be able to work together with our project team on this, and that's how this partnership came about.
I was born and raised in Lima, Peru. I came to the US for college. My dad's side of the family, they are indigenous from Ayacucho, and they speak Quechua. Both my grandparents speak Quechua very fluently, but it's sadly been lost generation through generation. It hit very close to home, trying to learn a language that it's been lost, and that could possibly be endangered in the future.
When Jess first showed the game in that framework, because she has done a lot of work on it, but the design wasn't fully implemented yet, what were your first reactions to it?
We went through every single screen and thought, what would be the steps that a user would take to learn how to play this Loteria game? How would they create a room? How would they join a room? How would they wait for people to join a room? Making sure that it is accessible for people without electronic devices. What happens when they don't have any Wi-Fi? What happens if they also want to hear the word pronounced? Like, what if they don't have anybody that speaks Zapotec and they just want to learn all of it?
Planning a game is quite a bit different than planning a website. With a game, there's a lot of other things to consider that are quite different, especially a multiplayer game where you want multiple people to be able to play at the same time, cross-device compatibility. One thing when we spoke to the people at CIELO that was very important for them is they said not everyone has a laptop, so some people might be joining on mobile phones. We want to be able to play with our friends and our family even outside of the class.
We were gonna have a digital version, which you could play digitally and play with other people, but you could also have the opportunity to actually print it out and just have the audio playing. Having those two kind of ways to interact is really special because it engages the collective as opposed to just the one person that's playing by themselves.
One thing that really struck with me, in my experience at least, is that whenever someone comes here, like to the US from a foreign country, they try to learn English, but someone who, for example, like me, who already knows English but wants to learn more about their native tongue, wants to learn, for example, Zapotec, they can play together and learn together since you can mix and match the languages. So it's not just for children, it's for really everybody.
Before we wrote even a single line of code, trying to think, what's the best approach? Should we use something like Unity, like a game engine, and have it embedded in a website? Or could I make this with Ruby on Rails, which is my comfort zone, because that's what I work with at work? We had to do this in JavaScript, and we chose to use the React framework in order to provide it structure. And that is not a language and a framework I'm used to working in, which can be very uncomfortable. Like, I know exactly what logic I want to write, but I don't know the syntax. I don't know how to structure it in functional JavaScript, in modern JavaScript. Mine is sort of an amalgamation of spaghetti jQuery code, which was not going to cut it for this project being made in 2022. Under normal circumstances, I would sort of have to rely on a lot of heavy use of search engines and looking for syntax. How do I do what I want to do? Pulling clips off of Stack Overflow, hoping that it was the correct answer and not buggy code and constant testing. But with Copilot, it almost worked like a translator. I knew what I wanted to write, and from the file name, it knew that I wanted React. And I could start writing, and it would oftentimes pop up the whole method. Now, I still needed to go through and do my due diligence and make sure that the variables were correct, that it was secure, that it was doing the right thing. But especially given that I was essentially working, I don't want to necessarily say foreign language like a human spoken foreign language, but I was working in a computer language that is not my first computer language. It is not my native computer language. And so having that to help guide that and give me that additional productivity boost was super helpful.
Being able to make it really easy for an organization that may not be as technical to use GitHub, and we can just walk them through. This is your game. It's one repo, and that's all there is. It's really easy for you to add other languages. You could just add another file, and there you have it. Another art file, and there you have another language on there.
Ahora, el gran momento o el gran acierto que tiene esta lotería es que va a ser liberado online y que todas las personas pueden tener acceso a este juego para amplificar la lengua, lo cual también amplía el horizonte imaginativo de la lucha por las lenguas, y creo que varios pueblos se van a inspirar y se pueden inspirar a partir de este proceso de lotería que CIELO creó.
It's such a beautiful project, helping people reclaim an indigenous language that they're in the process of losing, making sure that the people in their community and the children, even outside of where they're traditionally from, will still be able to have this language and this culture. There is at least one dialect of Zapotec that now has more people, like more speakers of that dialect living in the LA area than living in the mountains where they're from. And that's a story of, in some ways, tragedy, like the human migration, the droughts, the turmoil, the conflicts that drive people away from their homes and land, that they have this huge deep connection with. But it's also a story of resilience, finding new communities, and within those communities, doing activist work to make sure that your children and your grandchildren won't lose that connection to culture and won't lose that connection to their language.
This has to be a collective effort by the indigenous communities. If a linguistic revitalization project is not creating new speakers, then we cannot really talk about success, because the goal is to create those speakers in order to give continuity to the language, to give continuity to the culture.
If I were doing this as my job, would be that I'd probably have a KPI that was around some metric like how many users do we have? And so say I built this game and I said, look, everyone, we've successfully got 10,000 users worldwide learning Zapotec. That might be successful, but not really, because why would that be important, that 10,000 people who have the time and luxury to sit in Rome or in London or in LA and learn on their phone some Zapotec? Why would that be more meaningful than there's a classroom of 5 Zapotec children learning Zapotec? So I think that's one of the biggest differences on this project is the scale doesn't matter. It's helping in a small way provide just a modicum of justice and restoration through these time and resources being shifted. Colonial governments have spent billions of dollars working to get rid of indigenous people, get rid of their language, get rid of their culture. And so in just my own small way, being able to say, we're gonna take some of those resources and some of that time, and we're gonna give you a tool that you asked for in the way you wanted it, and give some language back to your children, I think is probably the most important thing to me about this whole project.
Me parece un gran acierto, me parece un gran proyecto el que estén pensando en estas vías lúdicas, porque quienes han transmitido la lengua son las madres y los padres o los abuelos y las abuelas que en las familias hablan en los idiomas indígenas a sus nietos.
It's the project that they asked for, that they're leading, that they're determining what should be built and how and when. Honestly, it's been amazing because I don't have to wonder, am I doing any harm? Is there something I should be speaking up about? It's just peaceful.
Learning some Zapotec words and also kind of the culture and ideas has really allowed me to go back to my grandmothers and talk to them and ask them more questions, interrogate them about what were the different ways that they lived previous to migration, what were the different ideas that they held, because I think that just personally, it's raised a lot of questions for me, right? What else are we missing?
Linguistic rights are not only self-determination rights. Linguistic rights are also a human right for indigenous peoples.
I would like for people to think about language as a fundamental human right, not as a service. The basis of our rights as humans is in our language. So for me, that is very important. And for CIELO, that's very important. Language is everything for us to exist, for us to have rights.